Today, on Issue at Hand, the beginning of a two-part series about Watchmen, one of the most influential comic books ever made. So, no pressure. This is Issue at Hand, Polygon's show about the world of comics, and I'm your host, Susana Polo. Today, I'm going to be talking about Watchmen, and I'm going to need 2 episodes to get through everything I want to say about it. On today's episode, I'm going to explain how and why Watchmen got made in the first place. I'll talk about what Watchmen is about and what it isn't about. And I'm going to break down some of the intricate storytelling techniques, a lot of them unique to comics, that have made it one of the most famous comic book stories ever told. If you don't already know, Watchmen is a 1986 12-issue comic book miniseries written by Alan Moore and drawn by Dave Gibbons. It was one of the first American comics to get noticed and receive significant praise from the literary world. It is among the best-selling graphic novels ever made and has had an incalculable impact on comics history. I have lots of critical thoughts about Watchmen, not all of them positive, but there's no denying this. It is a must-read for understanding comics. If you pick it up, just be prepared for it to depict graphic violence and an attempted rape. Today's episode will also contain some minor spoilers for the plot of Watchmen. This is your warning. Okay, let's get started. Clayton, take us back to the mid-80s. Yes, nuclear proliferation, a conservative government in power in the United States and England, the constant threat of the Cold War exploding into mutually assured destruction, the hope of the space race shaken forever by the Challenger disaster. Meanwhile, 15 years after a long period of self-censorship, American comics are still searching for ways to tell superhero stories that directly address and depict ideas and content not suitable for kids. Comic companies have just started to notice that if they reprint a long comic book story in paperback and call it a graphic novel, more people pay attention to it. And at DC, the company's universe was groaning under the weight of 30 years of uninterrupted continuity and a multiverse of parallel Earths. And it had recently acquired one more, the superhero universe of Charlton Comics, including characters like Captain Atom, Blue Beetle, and The Question. We'll come back to them. So DC had a set of characters they weren't using, and Alan Moore had been kicking around the idea of making a murder mystery about revamped old superheroes. He proposed Death of the Peacemaker, a miniseries cast with Charlton Comics characters, to DC managing editor Dick Giordano. Giordano liked it, but he wasn't hot on using Charlton's characters outright. Moore's story meant that a lot of them would be dead or difficult to reuse afterwards, and DC had just paid, real money for the rights to them. The Charlton Comics universe wound up getting mashed into the main timeline of the DC universe in the Crisis on Infinite Earths reboot. For Moore's pitch, Giordano asked that he create an original setting and cast instead, but Moore's story was still fundamentally about playing with specific superhero tropes. So he and Dave Gibbons set about creating a set of characters that echoed existing superheroes at Charlton, DC, and Marvel too. If Alan Moore is good at one thing, it's world building, and for Watchmen he created a 50-year alternate history of the United States, one where masked vigilantes began taking the law into their own hands in 1938, only to be outlawed when public opinion turned against them in 1977, just as a younger generation of costumed heroes was reaching their prime. In Watchmen, Woodward and Bernstein were murdered before exposing the Watergate scandal, and Richard Nixon abolished presidential term limits to serve well into the mid-80s. America won the Vietnam and Korean conflicts and kept a lid on Cold War tensions by having the world's only superhuman. And the existence of that superhuman allowed unexpected leaps in technology, like electric cars, flying ships, and these little pipes everybody smokes instead of cigarettes. Watchmen kicks off with the unexplained murder of Edward Blake, secretly the comedian, one of the first costumed crime fighters. The unstable underground vigilante known as Rorschach, after his shifting mask that resembles the inkblot test, is convinced that Blake's death is part of a conspiracy to eliminate all of the former masked heroes, and through Rorschach we get introduced to the rest of the cast. There's Night Owl, whose nerdy personality, gadgets, and legacy character status mark him as our Blue Beetle analog, with a bit of Batman thrown in. Silk Spectre is partly inspired by Charlton's Nightshade, but with her mother as the first Silk Spectre, takes plenty of influence from DC's Black Canary. Ozymandias, the smartest man in the world, was based on Charlton's Thunderbolt, who had all the powers afforded by perfect mental control of his own body. And finally, the nearly omnipotent Dr. Manhattan, Watchmen's only truly superpowered character. His origin story and design were inspired by Charlton's Captain Atom, but his influence on the history of the Watchmen setting is clearly intended to represent Superman. Starting from Rorschach's search for the truth, Moore and Gibbons guide the reader through an intricate story with multiple subplots. They deftly detail the history of superheroes in this alternate universe through the cast's backstories, while impregnating the whole book with a fraught scent of nuclear political horror. They pull characters apart and push them together, diving deeply, sometimes too deep, into their psyches. The ending of Watchmen is deservedly famous for how unexpected and harrowing it is, especially if you're expecting a superhero story. And the first thing you should know about Watchmen is that it's not a story about heroes. It's a story about a bunch of mostly damaged human beings who spent part of their lives dressing up in costumes and punching low-level criminals. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Watchmen doesn't endure just because of its story and characters and how well it speaks to living through the tension of the Cold War. It's also a structural masterpiece. The defining visual element of Watchmen is Moore and Gibbons' use of a 9-panel grid for nearly every page of it. It gives the entire comic a baseline visual rhythm that is only broken out of in moments of great significance. The book's rigid visual structure helps guide the reader through Moore's nonlinear storytelling, which he uses to draw parallels between past events and present ones, smoothing his exposition. He also uses it to show the reader how Dr. Manhattan experiences time. His ability to perceive every moment of his life simultaneously is a major plot point. Moore and Gibbons didn't invent the 9-panel grid, but Watchmen's use of it is so effective that it is indelibly associated with their work, even in completely unrelated stories by unrelated artists. Comics are fundamentally about pairing text with images, but Watchmen shows Gibbons and Moore mastering the form, using the juxtaposition of a completely disconnected textual and visual elements to create a new mood or overall meaning those elements wouldn't have had alone. And Watchmen is epistolary as well. Every issue except the last one is accompanied by 3 pages of back matter, where Moore writes fictional book excerpts and news clippings, scholarly essays, and reports that provide historical backstory and fill out Watchmen's subplots. Yes, subplots, because Watchmen has 3 major ones. They lay the groundwork for its climactic ending, they give us insight into what it's like to be an average citizen in this strange world, and, well, then there's the Black Freighter, a comic book within a comic book. Causally, its story has no relation to the plot, but thematically it enhances Watchmen's creeping horror and serves as a versatile metaphor for the book's many characters who have lost touch with their humanity and their fellow humans. Moore is a master of subtly connecting disparate storylines through the use of a striking, repeated visual. Watchmen's most famous motif is, of course, the smiley face with a blood drop, but look at this repeated visual of the lover's silhouette. Moore and Gibbons use it in a formative moment of Rorschach's childhood, and unseen graffiti artists tag it all over New York City. While one character likens the painted silhouettes to those photographed after the nuclear attack on Hiroshima, it's also used for Night Owl and Silk Spectre as they reach out for each other in the face of another terrible, deadly catastrophe. True human connection, we know by then, is something that Rorschach was never offered and never learned to ask for or accept. We see Dan and Laurie, and on the facing page we see the same shape on Rorschach's mask, as he is the most alone, physically, emotionally, and ideologically, that he has been in the story. Watchmen is a dense read, but like all good literary works, it rewards close readings and repeated readings. Everything that's surprising about the ending is established in the story from the beginning. No single element in it stands alone, but instead ripples out in repeated themes and parallel arcs. It's Watchmen's depth that has made it a comic book regarded among great American novels. But its legacy is more than that, and more complicated than just being the best regarded superhero novel. Next time on Issue at Hand, I'll talk about all the ways that Watchmen failed comics, and that comics have failed Watchmen. Today on Issue at Hand, the beginning of a 2-part series about Watchmen, one of the most influential... This is what happens when I don't get enough sleep on Thursday nights.